Hi everyone, I wanted to make another short video just going over our early romantic poet slides. We're going to be talking about Blake, Wordsworth, and Coleridge this week. So I think what's kind of fun about these writers is that even though they lived a long time ago, and even though, some of these poems, we read them and it's like a little bit like, I don't know, you can definitely feel that time has passed. At the same time, these are like some very exciting, subversive poets. Uh, William Blake is no exception. So he lived a pretty tumultuous lifestyle in some ways. He was in a very unhappy marriage. He kind of went up and down in terms of his desirability as an artist. Some people really loved him, and then he kind of fell out of fashion, and then he became really famous, and then he wasn't really that famous during his life. Not even really famous. He became somewhat successful. People kind of tried to give him a shot, and then he just kind of kept having problems, and eventually even was charged with sedition, or was accused of sedition, not charged, fortunately for him. But another thing that I think is interesting about him as a romantic poet is that he saw himself as a prophet, kind of literally. And so when you look at some of his poetry, we can see how he's making commentary on industrialization and reverence of nature, which of course we're going to see throughout. Um, these poets, but he's also going to do some like pretty direct like prophesizing. And if you look at some of his other work, he really is doing a lot in terms of God's relationship to man, man's relationship to God, and God and man's relationship with nature, and kind of how those things are all intertwined. Um, One of the things that's important to keep in mind with Blake is that he was a visual artist first and foremost. And by the end of his life, he was doing exclusively visual arts. And so if we look at some of his poetry, in pretty much any poetry collection, they're going to include at least the tiger, the engraving that he did of the tiger, and then of course later watercolors. And of course, some of these have been painted by other people too. It's just something to keep in mind, but we can see his original um, design in the engraving. Um, if we're looking at the form of his poems, it's kind of interesting comparing these two, I think, because they're really formally different in terms of if we look at the stanzas of The Lamb, we have two stanzas, 10 lines. Kind of a complex rhyme scheme there too. It's almost hard to describe, even though it's a lot of repeated words. So it's not even just that the words rhyme at the end of the lines, but that they're literally just repeated words. We see this with other romantic poets too, like Burns, for example. But I think it's really interesting because we don't necessarily see that in a lot of Blake's poetry. So I think it's interesting to see it in something kind of as innocent, right? His songs of innocence, as The Lamb. If we look at the tiger, it's going to be something a little bit more traditional. We have our six 4-line stanza, so pretty traditional for a romantic period poem. And what else? So our rhyme scheme for this one, again, is going to be more consistent. So AABB. So that's much more, much easier to describe, right? But then like looking at the meaning of these two poems, and some of you have already made interesting points about this. You can see how the lamb, there's this very kind of purity to this poem, right? It feels idyllic. It feels like we're in nature, pastoral. And then when we move on to the tiger, we're definitely still seeing nature. We're still definitely seeing some of the same ideas, but bringing in some of these industrial ideas as well. And so, for example, we have description of chains, anvils, hammers. Blake is going to, he's going to have kind of a lot of different types of poetry, honestly. And to, for what it's worth, I find Blake just completely puzzling. He's someone who the more I learn about him, the more I'm like, what is going on? But one thing we can definitely find is in his artwork and his poetry, kind of a darkness, maybe even maybe not pessimism, but kind of a critical eye towards industrialization. He seems cynical or skeptical of it. And we can definitely see, I mean, this is making me think already of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who we'll read soon, and when we get to Victorian period, when we're looking at his poems about chimney sweeps, right? All right, so we're going to move on to Wordsworth. Wordsworth is probably the most famous poet of this era. Well, I mean, I don't know. To me, he seems to be the most famous. He takes up a huge portion of my Norton anthology that I had to buy back in my literature class. He's pretty prolific. He's writing poems left and right. He's pretty consistent. He seemed to have a very consistent philosophy throughout his life, which I think makes him really easy to understand and study and teach. Um, and yeah, he really believed in these ideals of, which I talk about. Let's see, where is it here? This is just a slide from the previous week, but this idea of, spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings being at the heart of poetry, but that you reflect on those powerful feelings later. And so we can see that um, throughout Lyrical Ballads, lots of poems. If you want to read through some of his other poems from the Lyrical Ballads collection, they're really short. Tintern Abbey is actually the longest, I think the longest one in there. Well, actually, maybe not, but it's pretty long, right? There's a lot of little ones, like We Are Seven is pretty short. It's a little long. Tintern Abbey, though, is going to be pretty long, and pretty it doesn't necessarily feel as lyrical, right, as some of his other poems that have like strong rhyme scheme, kind of like, a nice rhythm to the lines in the stanzas. This one is going to be like much more, I think, narrative, right? I feel like we're getting a real sense of his experience on that day. It's very evocative, for sure. It's just that it doesn't quite have the same feeling as some of his other poems. So it might be worth checking those out. He calls himself in this poem a worshiper of nature, and I think that's clear. I know I am like absolutely repeating myself over and over, but this is just such a prevalent theme in this era, right? He's going to talk about the setting. He's going to talk about his relationship with nature, how remembering these moments in nature brings him peace, even in difficult times. And so, yeah, he's just describing this time when he was 23. He went to some ruins and hiked around with his sister. Um, it doesn't necessarily sound so profound, but I think one of the things he talks about is how he's matured since then, and how, maybe when he was younger, he's only 28 when he's writing this, but when he's talking about when he's younger and how his desires are so physical, right? It's just about playing and running around. And then he gets a little bit older, and then it becomes kind of a more desperate kind of desire, right? In terms of unquenchable, and then but still pretty physical and not necessarily getting into the mind yet. And then as he gets older, and of course he's describing himself at 28, he's now starting to introduce sense to his memory and to his desire. And so this is when he's able to maybe have that profound insight when remembering this hike with his sister. But just keep in mind when we're thinking of Wordsworth, it's just he is very, like I said, consistent. He has a strong philosophy based in this idea of spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions, recollected in tranquility, which is our quote from the textbook in his biography section. We're going to see that throughout. This is from the Lyrical Ballads preface, which is an extremely important text if you want to read more of it. I linked to it here, but it is quite long. And even though I think he's pretty easy to read compared to other writers of the time, I know you got other things to do, right? Yeah, We Are Seven is another famous one. One of the things that we'll see in a lot of his poetry is going to be a focus on common language, trying to speak like people actually talked at the time, which, is refreshing. At least for me now reading it, I'm like, oh, I can understand this so easily. It's pretty easy to read. Again, relatively speaking. And that was really subversive at the time. In Lyrical Ballads, when he and Coleridge put that out, and mostly him, to be honest, mostly Wordsworth, this was kind of like groundbreaking. People were, thought of poetry as something kind of grand, dealing with grand subjects, with grandiose language, a way of, kind of kind of like a higher purpose, and trying to be as objective as possible, and having this decorum and focused on royalty and God. Lyrical ballads were really getting into talking about nature, talking about man, talking about desire. And so it's just like a lot more earthy. And some people found it kind of the word that Coleridge uses is like mean in its language and subject, but I think just kind of like it's like too earthy, too basic. There were strong responses to it at the time, but I mean, it's just the resonances of this text are so profound. Um, yeah, these romantics, they really liked emotion and subjectivity, and so I think we can really see that in Tintern Abbey, right? He's really just talking about his memories and how he's changed over time and how this experience meant so much to him. And that is just something that we probably would not have seen in earlier poetry, or at least of the previous era. Um, so like I said, subjectivity is a really big theme here. And one of the things that I would recommend is, again, I think it might be helpful to look at some of Wordsworth's other poetry in order to kind of help see some of these themes a little more clearly, and applying them to Tintern Abbey, which is probably his most famous poem. Um, and the one that I want you to be the most familiar with because it's the most likely to show up on any test. Uh, but, my favorite poem by Wordsworth is actually She Dwelt Among the Untrodden Ways. And I think that this one is good for showing also this value in subjectivity and of rural poor subjects. He's describing a girl or a woman in this poem who has died, and who she lived unknown, and few could know when Lucy ceased to be. It was like people didn't know her, they didn't even know she had died, right? She's so irrelevant and unimportant to most people. But then at the end of the poem, this is how it ends. It says, "But she is in her grave, and oh, the difference to me." And it's like every time I read that line, it just is like, oh, my heart. And it's funny because most people think that Lucy didn't even exist. Wordsworth wrote a bunch of Lucy poems. If you want to learn more about that, you can read about that here. Um, but we can still feel, I mean, in his imagination, if nothing else, he's clearly built this person who he loves and cares about. And so this again is this is so subjective, something like love, something like someone who only he knows or a few people even know has died or cared about at all when she was alive. This is something that really wasn't, done in the previous era, but is so important in the Romantic period. Okay, finally, Coleridge. Um, Coleridge is fun. I love Coleridge. If you are looking for something kind of exciting, Coleridge is the place to go. He is very interested in the supernatural, which I think, just based on what I've read from a lot of you, is probably something that you're interested in. And hopefully that means that you liked The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is far and above his most famous poem. And I think for a good reason. I think it's a really interesting story. Wordsworth does claim that he's actually the one who thought of it. He talks about how he gave Coleridge the idea while they were out on a walk with his sister. And I guess she's confirmed it, but whatever. Um, I don't know, maybe take that with a grain of salt. Um, but yeah, Coleridge basically, he had a pretty nice childhood. He's the son of a vicar. He gets um sent to London when he's growing up, I think because his dad had passed away. I can't remember the details, specifics, but and this is something that he and Wordsworth talk about as being such a tragedy, because living in the city when you could live in the country would be so terrible, right? For these people who worship nature. But the other thing to know about Coleridge is that despite maybe a pretty happy upbringing, overall, like a pretty stable childhood, he had a strong enough connection with his siblings that they saved him when he enlisted in military service, which he was absolutely not prepared for and almost died. He was absolutely radical and kind of uh, uh, he lived an extremely tumultuous lifestyle, struggled a lot with drug addiction, which he was prescribed laudanum or opiates for back pain. And then he became addicted to it, and it was something that he really suffered from until he was treated later in life, and but still continued to suffer unfortunately. Um, on top of that, though, I mean, he was just a big thinker. He loved philosophy. He went to Germany to study German philosophy. And I think you can really see that in his work. He really is, he and Wordsworth agree about the importance of nature, the importance of rural poor, and kind of these like more simple subjects, right? Like in terms of their value. And he really thought Wordsworth was a genius, but he is, I think, a little bit more interested in something deeper than that, like more philosophical. He has these kind of ideas about the mutuality of man and nature, or man and the world, man and God, even in a way, or kind of earthly beings in God, in a way that was offensive to a lot of people at the time. They thought that was like completely blasphemous. And so there's a lot of speculation about how maybe he put things in such a fragmented or poetic kind of way so that it would hide a little bit how radical his ideas were. And he even had this idea that he was going to start, I don't know if you've heard of this before, he was going to start a pantisocracy in Pennsylvania, Susquehanna, with a friend, and they married sisters, and they were like really planning on doing this thing, and this was going to be this like utopian commune where everybody shared work and resources. And it just didn't happen, and he ended up being really unhappy in his marriage. And so a lot of big ideas, and unfortunately not a lot of execution, and that includes his writing. um, so he's friends with Wordsworth. They published lyrical ballads together. Later, Coleridge is basically going to say, "Look, it's pretty much mostly Wordsworth. I published some poems, but they're really different from the stuff that Wordsworth was doing." He describes them as heterogeneous. Um, and but he's also talking about how they do have these kind of inner working goals, even if they ended up being so heterogeneous in terms of their product, right? So he felt like they were kind of uneven. And Wordsworth did a lot of pushing for Coleridge to change things. So, for example, in The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Coleridge had originally had this with kind of intense language. I can't even remember the rhyme. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner might have been the original title. I think it's the original title, but the spelling is so much more influenced by medieval spelling. And so, things are spelled really differently than this. And, maybe even just like Renaissance spelling, traditions. But there's some extra E's and stuff in there. And Wordsworth was like, look, this thing is freaking people out. They don't want to read this. And there was a lot of kind of criticism of the text that it was too difficult to understand. The little side, shoot, I can't think of the name of them, but the little descriptions that Coleridge has in the margins of what's going on in the poem, those were also in this kind of antiquated language. And so people just did not know what was going on. Anyway, Coleridge ended up going through and editing it. There's actually, I think, 18 different versions of this poem that he wrote in his lifetime. He wasn't really ever satisfied with it. And honestly, there isn't necessarily like a version of this poem that I think a lot of people feel satisfied with as being like what Coleridge would have seen as the ideal for this poem. Maybe it is kind of unfinished in that way, but there is, an accepted version, which is the one that we're reading, in terms of what scholars would read. It's 7 parts. And so definitely longer than anything else we're reading, right? And we have ballad stanzas, varying lines and rhyme schemes. This thing is hard to categorize, right? Whenever I'm trying to figure out, okay, so here's the rhyme scheme. Oh, here's how many lines there are. Then it changes, right? And I really think that seems, kind of representative of Coleridge in general, right? He just was not easy to pin down. He's not easy to figure out. The only thing I can figure out is that there's chaos that follows him, right? I think he's drawn to it. So in this poem, we're going to hear the story of an ancient mariner. He approaches this wedding guest who's trying to just go to a wedding, and Coleridge, or not Coleridge, the ancient mariner is like, looks him, he just has like one eye, looks him in the eye, and then he's mesmerized, and then he can't go into the wedding. He's kind of captive, right? And he tells him this whole story, this horrifying story. And the wedding guest is like kind of terrified, because as he's telling the story, he's like, wait a minute, is this person dead? Is this like a ghost? Is this an undead person, like a zombie or something? There's kind of this kind of question of like, who is this guy? And so it's kind of an interesting to have that frame narrative instead of just telling us directly who the Ancient Mariner uh, from the Ancient Mariner's perspective. But yeah, he shoots this albatross, right? He's just does this callous thing, kind of careless and mean. And then it ends up creating a series of events that are just worse and worse. And he ends up being the sole survivor, and even the ship itself sinks. Okay, you know where I'm going to go here. We got nature again. So nature is going to be a huge theme in this poem. And I think that, if we think about the Anna Barbauld quote that I shared in the discussion board, she talks about how this poem is amoral, and Coleridge responds, he's like, if anything, it's too moral. I'm pushing my theme or my moral too much on the reader. Maybe we could see that here. We have this reverence of nature. He shoots this albatross. That's when all the bad stuff happens. But more than that, we have whenever he is kind of finding his redemption in the poem, we see him kind of describing snakes, water snakes slithering around, and he's describing how beautiful they are. I have this little stanza here, kind of talking, kind of a quote from the poem that I thought showed this reverence of nature. And frankly, this is one of the most influential poems of all English literature, at least in my humble opinion. But anytime you hear anybody talking about an albatross, they're probably talking about this poem. Okay, I don't think albatrosses get talked about that much. If they do, they're probably talking about the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And there's a phrase we have in, maybe a little antiquated, but a phrase that you might hear, the albatross around my neck, or you might see that in other literature. And that's a direct reference, right, to them putting the albatross around the mariner's neck. And then another thing that you'll probably see, and again, look out for this. This will be on your tests, not necessarily in this class, although wink, but in life, this is going to be on tests in literature. It's water, water everywhere, and all the boards did shrink. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. And especially these last two lines of that stanza are just quoted and quoted and quoted. But sometimes they'll kind of rephrase this last line because it is pretty antiquated in its phrasing. So they'll make it sound a little more modern. Yeah. Okay, finally, this Biographia Literaria. I haven't said that in so long. I'm not 100% sure that's how you pronounce it. But he's going to publish this in 1817. So this is, 17 years after we had literary.
Bluetooth disconnected.
Oops, sorry. Literary ballads. Uh, sorry. Yep. So I just wanted to share a couple of the major quotes from this one that I thought were interesting. So you can check those out here. The main thing here, I think, is that Coleridge eventually disagrees with Wordsworth on some of his philosophy. And
Bluetooth connected.
I think that what you can really see is that Coleridge really started to esteem these German philosophers. I think they really influenced him, as well as just his difficult life. I think that he became a little more skeptical, a little more cynical, and saw a little bit more of maybe escapism, or he talks a lot about the imagination. That's kind of his focus in the book. And so I would recommend, if you want to read it at all, it's interesting, it's extremely dense, and Coleridge ended up having an issue with the printer, and so he ended up padding it a lot, which is just a nightmare. He added like 150 pages or something because he wanted it to be 2 volumes, or he promised that it would be 2 volumes, and then the publisher made a mistake, and so then he had to add a bunch of stuff that he didn't actually want in it. It's difficult. If you want to read it, I would recommend reading section 14 or chapter 14. That's where the bulk of it is in terms of the meaning, and that's where both of these quotes are from, I think. Maybe, yeah, I think both of them are from 14. Other than that, there's some other interesting stuff, but you're going to have to be patient if you read it because it is quite dense. These are the poems of this week. I'm sorry, I have a feeling I went long again, but I love talking about these guys, and I'm looking forward to next week's as well. Have a good one.